My sister was the golden child my whole life. My parents tried to take my $500,000 inheritance to give it to her, but I hired a lawyer and exposed them to the entire family. I'm 28 years old. I work in finance. And honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because what happened 3 months ago with my grandfather's inheritance basically blew up the entire family dynamic that I'd been putting up with my whole life. And when I say my whole life, I mean it literally, because this goes back to when I have memory. Like since I was a kid and my sister Isabella was born. I guess I should start there. When I was about 3 years old and my parents brought this baby home, and suddenly I went from being the center of attention to being, the piece of furniture that was there, but nobody really noticed. I don't know if you've ever experienced being the forgotten child, but it's a weird feeling because it's not like your parents hate you or anything. It's more like you're invisible compared to your sibling. I remember perfectly my 7th birthday. My parents bought me a cake from the grocery store and gave me like 2 gifts, nothing special. But Isabella's birthday that same year, when she turned 4, was basically a Broadway production. They hired a bounce house, a clown, invited all the neighborhood kids. There was a piñata, decorations all over the house, catering, everything. And I remember standing there thinking, wait, why wasn't my birthday like this? But of course, I was 7 years old. I didn't know how to express that, so I just swallowed it and moved on. The thing is that pattern never changed. It just got more obvious over the years. When I was about 10, I wanted a bicycle, one of those BMX bikes that all the kids in the neighborhood had. My parents told me if I wanted it, I had to save my money, do extra chores, that kind of thing. I spent literally 6 months saving every penny I could, mowing neighbors' lawns, washing cars, everything. I finally scraped together enough money and bought myself a used bike. It wasn't the prettiest, but it was mine, you know? I was super proud. 2 weeks later, Isabella sees my bike and starts throwing a tantrum because she wants one too. And you know what happened? My parents literally went the next day and bought her a brand new bike, one of those name brand ones with all the accessories. She didn't have to save anything, didn't have to make any effort. She just cried and got it. And it was like that with everything, like absolutely everything. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I got the lead role in the school play. I'd been rehearsing for months, and I was super excited because my parents were going to come see me. The day of the performance, literally an hour before, Isabella, who was like 8 years old, said her stomach hurt. My parents decided to stay home with her and miss my play. It turned out later that Isabella had nothing wrong. She just wanted attention because everyone was talking about my play. My parents didn't even apologize. It was more like, well, we had to make sure your sister was okay. And I was thinking, seriously? You're not even going to acknowledge that this wasn't right? Fast forward to when I was 17, I got a spot in a summer program at Harvard, like an incredible opportunity for high school students interested in finance and economics. I needed someone to take me to the airport on a Saturday at 6 in the morning. I asked my parents weeks in advance. The day before the trip, Isabella mentions she has a dance recital that same Saturday in the afternoon, and my parents suddenly can't take me to the airport because they need to rest for Isabella's recital. I had to ask a neighbor to take me. I felt so humiliated. And the worst part is, Isabella's recital wasn't even important. She had those recitals every 2 months, but my Harvard program was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. When it came time to apply to colleges, I had worked super hard. I had an almost perfect GPA. I was in a ton of extracurricular activities. I'd spent years building a solid application. I got acceptance to several good universities with partial scholarships. My parents' reaction? It was basically, "Oh, that's nice, Morgan," followed immediately by them starting to complain about how they were going to pay for the rest of the tuition that the scholarships didn't cover. Isabella at that time was finishing high school and had made it clear she didn't want to go to college. She wanted to take a gap year, which eventually turned into 5 gap years. But that's another story. My parents were like, "That's okay, honey. Do what makes you happy. You don't have to go to college if you don't want to. College isn't for everyone. Can you see the difference? I get scholarships, and it's a problem because it still costs money. Isabella decides not to go to college at all, and it's a brave personal decision that should be respected." It was so frustrating that it got to a point where I stopped sharing my achievements with them because I knew the response was going to be lukewarm at best or completely ignored at worst. I went to college and basically built my life completely independent of them. I worked throughout college, got internships every summer, graduated with honors, got a job in finance that paid well, and by 27, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a house. A small house, nothing fancy, but it was mine. My parents came to visit me once in all that time, and it was because Isabella wanted to see the city where I lived, not because they wanted to see my house or how I was doing. Meanwhile, Isabella was living in my parents' basement, didn't have a steady job, basically spent her days sleeping late and watching Netflix, and my parents acted like that was perfectly normal and acceptable. And what bothered me wasn't that Isabella had an easier life. The truth is, I was proud of what I'd built on my own. What bothered me was the total lack of recognition from my parents. The fact that never, not once, did they say, "Hey Morgan, we're proud of you. Look at everything you've accomplished." But with Isabella, it was constant. "Isabella, you're so special. Isabella, you're so talented. Isabella, you deserve the world." Talented at what? It was never clear. Then my grandfather Joseph died 3 months ago. He was my mom's dad, an incredible man who had worked his whole life and had managed to accumulate quite a bit of money through smart investments and a modest life. My grandfather was always good to me. He was one of the few people in the family who really saw me, you know? He asked me about my work, wanted to know about my investments, gave me advice. My grandmother Ruth was also always a support for me. She saw what was happening with my parents, and although she couldn't change their behavior, at least she let me know she valued me. The will reading was like 2 weeks after the funeral. The whole family was there, my parents, Isabella, my grandmother, some aunts and uncles, the lawyer. My grandfather had made it very clear in his will that his money should be divided equally among his grandchildren. There were 3 grandchildren total, me, Isabella, and my cousin from another state. $500,000 for each one. $500,000. When the lawyer read that, I was in shock. I had no idea my grandfather had that much money saved. It was an amount of money that would change my life. I could pay off my student loans completely, invest the rest, have real financial security for the first time in my life. But immediately, like before we even left the lawyer's office, my dad, Christopher, pulled me aside and said, "We need to talk about the inheritance." And I thought, okay, maybe he wants to talk about taxes or something technical. We went to a Starbucks nearby, and my parents, both of them, started with this prepared speech about how Isabella needed the money more than me, that I had a good job and a house and was doing okay financially, but Isabella was struggling, living for free in their house, but whatever, and that the right thing, the moral thing, what a good brother would do, would be to give my entire inheritance to Isabella. I couldn't believe it. I literally sat there with my mouth open. I said, "Are you serious? You're asking me to give away $500,000 that my grandfather left specifically to me?" And my mom, Elizabeth, started with the emotional manipulation, saying things like, "I thought you cared about your sister. I thought you were a better person than this. Your grandfather would have wanted you to help your sister. Family helps each other." And I was like, wait, if Grandpa had wanted everything to go to Isabella, he would have put it in the will. He specifically said, equal parts. My dad then changed tactics and said, "Well, as executor of the will, I have some discretion over how the funds are distributed." And that's when I realized this wasn't a request. They were literally planning to take my inheritance from me. I told him that was illegal and the will was clear. And my dad just smiled and said, "We'll see what the lawyer says about that." I left that Starbucks feeling physically sick, like my chest was going to explode. For the next 2 weeks, my parents wouldn't stop calling me, texting me, emails, everything pressuring me to sign some document giving up my inheritance. I didn't answer anything. Then I got a letter from the lawyer saying that my dad, as executor, had decided to interpret the will in a way that Isabella would receive a larger portion due to her financial need. Basically, he was trying to legally steal my money. I called my grandmother Ruth, completely desperate, crying on the phone. I didn't know what to do. She got furious, like I'd never heard her so angry. It turns out my grandfather had anticipated exactly this type of situation because he knew my dad, knew he might try to manipulate things. The will had a super specific anti-contestation clause, and my grandmother, who was co-executor along with my dad and another uncle, immediately contacted the lawyer and the other executor. What happened next was basically a 2-week legal war. The lawyer determined that my dad had a clear conflict of interest because he was trying to favor his own daughter over another beneficiary, which violated his duties as executor. Plus, the will was absolutely clear. There was no ambiguity. There was no legal way to change the distribution. My dad was removed as executor, and the will was executed exactly as my grandfather had written it. I was going to receive my $500,000. I thought that would be the end, but no, it was just the beginning of the real family drama. There was a family gathering about a month later, like a dinner where all the relatives were going to be, and I honestly didn't want to go, but my grandmother convinced me, saying I needed to be there. It was horrible, like one of the worst nights of my life. My dad attacked me publicly in front of the whole family, saying I was selfish, that I'd betrayed my sister, that I was a terrible son, that my grandfather would be ashamed of me. He started yelling so loud that literally other relatives had to ask him to calm down or leave. My mom didn't defend him, but she didn't defend me either. She just sat there crying and saying she couldn't believe the family was being destroyed like this. Isabella didn't say anything in my defense either. She just stayed quiet looking at her plate. That hurt almost more than everything else, because part of me expected her to say something, to acknowledge that this wasn't fair, that she had also received her inheritance and I deserved mine. But nothing. I finally left that dinner. My grandmother left with me, and in the car she told me something that changed my whole perspective on the situation. She told me that several months before he died, my grandfather had told her that my parents had visited him specifically to ask him to change his will and leave everything to Isabella. They'd given him a whole presentation about how I didn't need the money and Isabella did. Exactly the same argument they'd given me. My grandfather had completely refused and had been furious, according to my grandmother. He had told her that he loved his 2 grandchildren equally and that he wasn't going to participate in the sick favoritism my parents had. Those were his words, sick favoritism. Knowing that validated me in a way I can't describe. My whole life I doubted myself, thinking, maybe I'm being sensitive. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I am the problem. But my grandfather had seen it, had recognized it, and had taken steps to make sure I was treated fairly, at least in this. About a week later, I decided to confront Isabella directly. I went to my parents' house when I knew they weren't there and knocked on the basement door. Isabella opened. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. I told her we needed to talk, and surprisingly, she agreed. We sat in her basement area, which was basically like a small apartment my parents had built for her, another example of favoritism. But anyway, and we finally had an honest conversation. I asked her why she'd never said anything, why she'd never defended me. And she started crying and said she was scared, that her whole identity was wrapped up in being mom and dad's favorite, that she didn't know who she was without that. She admitted the favoritism wasn't fair, that she'd always known it, but it was easier to just accept it and benefit from it than to question it. She said something that really impacted me. She said, "You think it was easy for me to be the favorite, but it wasn't. I never learned to do anything for myself because they always did everything for me. They never pushed me to be better because I was already perfect in their eyes. You know what I mean? And now I'm 25 years old, living in my parents' basement, without a college degree, and without real skills. And you have a career, and a house, and a life. I didn't expect that perspective. Honestly, I'd always thought Isabella had the easier situation, and in many ways she did, but it had also hurt her in different ways. I asked her what she was going to do with her inheritance, and she said she'd been thinking about finally going to college, studying graphic design, which was something she'd always been interested in, but had never pursued. She said she wanted to use the money to educate herself and become independent, to build something for herself for the first time in her life. That conversation didn't fix everything between us, like there was still a lot of resentment and wounds from years, but it was a start. I felt like for the first time I was talking to my sister as a real person, not as the golden princess on a pedestal that our parents had created. Of course, when my parents found out Isabella was planning to go to college and move out of their house, they went crazy. My dad literally told Isabella that if she left, he'd sell the family home and it would be her. fault they lost their house, which was a ridiculous lie, but that's the level of manipulation we were dealing with. My mom cried constantly, saying Isabella was abandoning her, that after everything they'd done for her, this is how she repaid them. Isabella called me crying several times during that period, doubting her decision, feeling guilty. I supported her the best I could, reminded her she was 25 years old and had the right to live her own life. Eventually, Isabella held firm in her decision and enrolled in a university for the spring semester. She found a small apartment near campus and moved out about 2 months ago. It's the first time in her life she's lived alone, and from what she tells me, it's been difficult, but also liberating. We've been rebuilding our sibling relationship slowly. We meet for coffee every 2 weeks or so, and it's starting to get easier to talk without all the weight of the family dynamic on us. We're not where I want us to be yet, but we're making progress, I guess. As for the inheritance, I paid off all my student loans immediately, like $70,000 total. The feeling of being free from that debt was incredible. I invested most of the rest conservatively, but I also donated a significant amount to mental health organizations because I felt it was important to give something back. And I started a small scholarship fund at my university for students from dysfunctional families who are working to be independent. It's not much yet, but each year I can add more. My mom has tried to reconcile with me in recent weeks. She started going to therapy. Her therapist apparently told her she needed to acknowledge the harm she'd done and sent me a long letter apologizing for the favoritism, for not defending me, for trying to take my inheritance. She says she wants to have a relationship with me, but understands if I need space. I don't know what to do with that, honestly. Part of me wants to forgive her because she's my mom, but another part of me is like, 30 years of favoritism doesn't get erased with a letter and a few therapy sessions. My dad, on the other hand, hasn't changed at all. He keeps insisting he was right, that I was selfish, that I ruined the family. He told several relatives his version of the story, where I basically robbed money from my poor defenseless sister with the help of my manipulative grandmother. Some relatives who don't know the full story believed him, and those relationships are basically dead now. But the ones who matter, the ones who really know me, know the truth. My grandmother tells me my dad probably never will change, that some people are so committed to their narrative that admitting they're wrong would mean admitting they've been wrong their whole life, and that's something he'll never do. Last week, Isabella called to tell me she'd just turned in her first major project in her design class and got an A. She was so excited, and I was genuinely happy for her. She asked if she could send me the project, and I said yes, of course. It's a poster about mental health and talks about breaking toxic family patterns. I don't know if she made it thinking about us specifically, but the connection is obvious. She told me she'd shown it to our parents, hoping they'd be proud, and my dad had told her she was wasting her time with school and should be using her money more wisely. Isabella told me that and then said, "For the first time, I understand why you left," and never looked back. I don't know how all of this is going to end ultimately. I'm still processing 30 years of being invisible, of being the forgotten child, of working twice as hard for half the recognition. The inheritance didn't fix any of that. Money doesn't heal the trauma of growing up feeling less than. But what it did do was give me the validation that at least my grandfather saw me, valued me, and wanted to make sure I was treated equitably. And that means more than the $500,000. Honestly. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled things differently. If I should have confronted my parents about the favoritism when I was younger. If I should have talked to Isabella sooner. But I also know I was a kid. And kids shouldn't have to beg for equal love and attention from their parents. That should be given freely. What I do know is that I'm not going to repeat this pattern. If I ever have kids, I'm going to make sure each one feels seen, valued, loved equally. Because I've lived on the other side, and I know exactly what it feels like. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone.